At dinner, my wife's sister sneered. "How does it feel being the most useless one here?" My wife and everyone laughed except me. I just smiled and said, "How does it feel knowing this useless one won't be paying your bills anymore?" The moment those words left my mouth. You know that feeling when you're sitting in a room full of people who think they know you, but they don't have a clue? That's exactly where I found myself last Saturday evening, squeezed into one of those uncomfortable antique chairs that Tessa's mom, Patricia, insisted on keeping around her dining room table. The whole setup screamed old Charleston money, the kind that whispers instead of shouts, but makes damn sure everyone knows it's there. The weekend gathering was Patricia's thing. Every month, like clockwork, she'd summon the family for what she called reconnecting over a proper meal. Translation: let's all get together so I can remind everyone how much better my side of the family is than wherever the hell you came from. I've been showing up to these things for 8 years now, ever since Tessa and I got married. And honestly, I should have seen this coming a mile away. There I was cutting into some overpriced piece of beef that probably cost more than most people's grocery budget for the week, listening to the usual soundtrack of this family's greatest hits. Patricia was going on about some charity gala she was organizing, dropping names like breadcrumbs for anyone desperate enough to follow her social climbing trail. Tessa's dad, Everett, was nursing his third bourbon and nodding along like everything his wife said was pure genius. And Graham, Tessa's younger brother, was doing that thing he always does, trying to sound important while talking about absolutely nothing. But it was Bree who really set the stage for what was about to go down. Tessa's older sister had this way of making every conversation about her. And tonight was no different. She was perched there in her designer dress, the one that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, swirling her wine around like she was some kind of sommelier instead of a failed entrepreneur who couldn't keep a business afloat to save her life. "You know," Bree said. And I could already tell by that tone that whatever was coming next wasn't going to be good. I was telling my friend Sarah about our family dinner traditions, and she was just amazed by how diverse our little group is. Diverse, right? Code for look at the charity case we let sit at our table. I kept eating, kept my mouth shut because that's what I'd learned to do over the years. Don't rock the boat. Don't make waves. Just smile and nod, and let them have their little superiority complex. Because at the end of the day, family harmony was more important than my ego. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. Tessa was laughing at something Ken had said. Bree's husband, who worked in real estate and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone about his latest big sale. The guy was basically a walking LinkedIn post. But he fit right in with this crowd. All flash, all surface, all about looking good instead of actually being good. That's when Bree decided to really go for it. She set down her wine glass with that little deliberate clink that meant she was about to say something she thought was incredibly clever. And she looked right at me with this smirk that I'd seen 1,000 times before. "So, Miles," she said, and the whole table went quiet because everyone could sense what was coming. "How does it feel being the most useless one here?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette. For a second, nobody moved. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to stop ticking. Then, like someone had pressed play on a movie that had been paused, the laughter started. First, Tessa with this high-pitched giggle that I'd heard her use when she was nervous, but trying to fit in. Then, Patricia covering her mouth with her napkin like that made the laughter more polite. Everett let out this deep chuckle, the kind that said he agreed, but was trying to be subtle about it. Graham snorted into his beer. Even Ken who owed me 15 grand from when his real estate deals went south 2 years ago, was laughing like Bree had just delivered the punchline of the century. But here's the thing about moments like that. Time slows down and you get this crystal clear view of exactly where you stand with people. You see their true faces stripped of all the polite and family obligation nonsense. And what I saw around that table was 8 years of barely concealed contempt finally getting its moment in the spotlight. I should have been angry. Hell, I should have been furious. But instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Absolute clarity. It was like someone had just handed me the keys to a door I'd been standing in front of for years, too scared or too stupid to try to handle. So, I smiled. Not one of those fake everything's fine smiles that I'd been wearing to these dinners for nearly a decade. This was different. This was the smile of a man who just realized he'd been playing a game where the other players had been cheating the whole time. I set down my fork, dabbed my mouth with a napkin, using those perfect table manners that Patricia had insisted I learn, and looked right back at Bree with that same calm expression I'd perfected over years of swallowing my pride. "How does it feel?" I said, my voice steady and clear enough that everyone could hear every single word. "Knowing this useless one won't be paying your bills anymore." The laughter died faster than a smartphone battery on a cold day. Bree's wine glass froze halfway to her lips, and I could literally see the color draining from her face. The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on that expensive Persian rug. That was the moment everything changed. Not just for that evening, but for everything that came after. Because sometimes when someone hands you the perfect opportunity to tell the truth, you take it. And sometimes when you finally stop being useful to people who think you're useless, you discover who you really are. The grenade had been pulled, and there was no putting the pin back in. Here's what kills me about people like Bree and her whole crew. They see what they want to see, and everything else might as well be invisible. To them, I was just this guy who worked from home in his pajamas, probably playing video games all day while their precious Tessa brought home the real money. They had it all figured out in their heads. I was the deadbeat husband who got lucky enough to marry up into their perfect little Charleston dynasty. If only they knew what I actually did for a living. See, while they were out there networking at country clubs and dropping names at charity gall, I was quietly building something they couldn't even wrap their heads around. Grant consultancy doesn't sound sexy. I'll give you that. When people ask what I do, their eyes usually glaze over before I finish explaining. But here's the thing about grants. There's serious money in them if you know what you're doing. And I've been in this game long enough to know exactly what I'm doing. I started my consultancy, Meridian Grant Solutions, about 10 years ago, right after I got tired of watching nonprofits and small businesses struggle to navigate the bureaucratic nightmare that is federal and state funding. Turns out, I had a knack for translating their real-world needs into the kind of academic jargon that grant committees eat up. More than that, I understood the system, who was funding what, when the money was flowing, and how to position a proposal so it landed on the right desk at exactly the right time. My home office might not look like much to someone expecting corner offices and glass towers. But from that little room overlooking our back garden, I've pulled in more money than most of these people see in their flashiest years. We're talking 6 figures annually, sometimes pushing 7 when I land those big federal contracts. But since I work in shorts and a t-shirt, since I don't drive a BMW or wear a Rolex, since I actually prefer staying home to hitting up networking events, they all just assumed I was some kind of charity case. And Tessa, she was more than happy to let them think whatever they wanted to think. The first time I bailed out Bree's yoga studio was back in 2019. She'd blown through her startup capital in about 6 months. Turns out organic kombucha and crystal healing workshops don't pay the bills quite like she thought they would. She was 3 weeks behind on rent, had creditors calling every day, and was about 2 seconds away from having to shut down the whole operation. I remember the call. Tessa came into my office, tears streaming down her face, begging me to help her sister. She's worked so hard for this, Miles. This studio is her dream. So, I did what I always did. I wrote the check, 15 grand to cover back rent and get her current. Another 10 to help with inventory and marketing. $25,000 just like that, because family comes first, right? Did Bree ever thank me directly? Hell no. She thanked Tessa, sent her flowers, posted on social media about how grateful she was for her amazing support system. But when she looked at me at family dinners after that, it was like I was just another piece of furniture. Then there was Graham's DUI situation. Kid got pulled over coming back from some bachelor party in Savannah, blew a 0.12, and suddenly he's looking at jail time, license suspension, and lawyer fees that would have buried him. His teaching salary wasn't going to cover it. And his parents sure as hell weren't about to tap into their retirement fund for his mistakes. So, guess who got the tearful phone call? Guess who ended up covering 12 grand in legal fees, fines, and court costs? And guess who never got so much as a handwritten thank you note? But the real kicker was Tessa's parents and their property tax situation. 3 different times over the years, Everett's investments went sideways, and they found themselves scrambling to cover their annual property tax bill on that big house of theirs. You know, the one they used to host these monthly dinners where they looked down on everyone else. Yeah, that house. Each time it was the same song and dance. Patricia would call Tessa, sobbing about how embarrassing it would be if they lost the family home, how they'd never lived down the shame in their social circle. Tessa would come to me with those big eyes, asking if there was any way we could help, just this once. And like an idiot, I'd transfer the money, 8 grand the first time, 12 the second, 15 the third. The really twisted part. They never asked where the money was coming from. Not once. They just assumed their golden daughter had it handled. Maybe through some trust fund they'd forgotten about or investment account they didn't know she had. It was easier for them to believe in magic money than to acknowledge that the guy they treated like an unemployed loser was actually keeping their whole family afloat. I kept records of everything. Every transfer, every check, every time I stepped in to save someone's ass while they were busy pretending I didn't exist. Digital records, paper receipts, email chains, bank statements. The whole paper trail sitting right there in my filing cabinet, organized by year and family member. Not because I was planning some big revenge scheme. Hell, I wasn't even thinking about it most of the time. I kept records because that's what you do when you're running a business, when you're responsible with money. When you understand that every dollar going out needs to be accounted for. It's called being an adult. But sitting there at that dinner table, watching them laugh at Bree's little joke, something clicked. 8 years of being treated like dead weight by people who'd been living off my generosity without even realizing it. 8 years of being dismissed and disrespected while I quietly kept their whole world from falling apart. Bree thought she was making a joke about the most useless person at the table. What she didn't realize was that she just lit the fuse on 8 years of documented proof that I was actually the most essential person in that room. And now it was time for them to find out what useful really meant. I wasn't always the invisible man at the dinner table. Hell, there was a time when I had dreams that would have knocked these people's socks off. Ambitions that made their little Charleston society games look like kindergarten playground politics. But somewhere along the way, I traded those dreams for something I thought was more important. Fitting in with a family that never wanted me to fit in at all. Growing up in rural Georgia, about 2 hours outside of Atlanta, I was the kid who always had big plans. My dad, Robert Granger, worked construction his whole life. Honest work that left him with calloused hands and a straight back, even when arthritis started setting in. He wasn't much for fancy words or philosophical discussions, but he had this way of dropping wisdom that stuck with you whether you wanted it to or not. Son, he'd tell me while we worked on his old Ford pickup in our driveway. There are two kinds of men in this world. The ones who spend their time telling everyone how great they are, and the ones who spend their time actually being great. Guess which ones end up happier? I learned early that actions mattered more than words. That building something real was worth more than talking about building something someday. While my classmates were bragging about what cars they drive or what colleges they'd attend, I was actually working summers at the hardware store. Weekends helping Dad with side jobs, learning that money earned through sweat meant something different than money that just showed up in your bank account. When I got to Georgia Tech on a partial academic scholarship, I thought I had the world figured out. I was going to be an engineer, design bridges or skyscrapers, leave my mark on the skyline of some major city. I had notebooks full of sketches, ideas for structures that could change how people moved through urban spaces. My professors said I had real talent, the kind of spatial thinking that couldn't be taught. But then I met Tessa during my junior year. She was everything I wasn't. Polished, connected, comfortable in social situations that made me want to crawl under a rock. She was majoring in art history, which seemed like the most luxurious thing in the world to a kid who'd worked for every textbook he'd ever owned. When she talked about spending summers in Europe, visiting museums and galleries, it was like listening to stories from another planet. I fell hard, harder than I'd ever fallen for anything in my life. And when she brought me home to meet her family that first Christmas break, I knew I was walking into a different league entirely. The house alone was enough to make my head spin. One of those historic Charleston mansions with more square footage than my entire neighborhood back home. Her family had the kind of casual wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The kind that just assumed everyone around them understood the rules of their particular game. I tried to be myself at first. Talked about my engineering projects, my plans for after graduation, the construction work I'd done with my dad. But I could see it in their eyes. That polite confusion people get when they're trying to figure out how to respond to something they don't consider important. Everett would nod and say, "That's nice," in the same tone you'd use with a 5-year-old who'd just shown you a crayon drawing. Slowly, without really noticing it happening, I started changing. Started downplaying the engineering dreams. Started focusing more on what they wanted to hear. Tessa would introduce me to her friends as my boyfriend, who's really practical and down to earth, which was code for he's not like us, but he's useful. After we got married, the transformation was complete. They'd found their designated fixer, the guy who could handle the dirty work of actually solving problems while they focused on the important business of looking good and feeling superior. Need someone to research contractors for the kitchen renovation? Call Miles. Having trouble with the insurance company after the fender bender? Miles will handle it. Tax situation getting complicated. Miles knows about that stuff. I became their personal Google, their human Wikipedia, their go-to guy for anything that required actual work instead of just connections and charm. And the crazy part, I was good at it. Really good. I had this knack for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense, for finding solutions that other people missed, for making complicated problems simple. That's how I ended up in grant consulting in the first place. After college, I took a job with a nonprofit in Charleston, helping them navigate federal funding applications. I was making decent money, but nothing spectacular. Then I realized I could do the same work as an independent consultant and make 3 times as much. My father always said, "Strong men don't boast, they build." So I built a business, built a reputation, built a life that could support not just me and Tessa, but apparently her entire extended family. I built it quietly, without fanfare, without asking for recognition. But I also built something else without realizing it. A prison made of other people's expectations. They called themselves achievers. These people. Bree with her failed business ventures that I kept funding. Graham with his teaching job that barely covered his car payment. Tessa's parents with their social climbing and their house that they couldn't actually afford to maintain. They measured success by how things looked from the outside, by what kind of car you drove, and which country club accepted your membership application. Meanwhile, I was actually achieving things, building wealth, solving problems, creating value. But because I wasn't flashy about it, because I didn't wear my success like a damn peacock, they assumed I wasn't successful at all. My father had been right about strong men building instead of boasting. But he left out one crucial piece of advice. Strong men also know when to walk away from people who mistake their strength for weakness. And sitting at that dinner table, listening to them laugh at their own cruelty, I realized I'd been wearing a mask for so long that I'd almost forgotten what my real face looked like underneath. But Bree's little joke had just ripped that mask clean off. Monday morning hit different after that dinner. I woke up at my usual time, 6:30 a.m. sharp. But instead of feeling that familiar weight of obligation pressing down on my chest, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete freedom. It was like someone had cut invisible chains I'd been dragging around for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to move without them. Tessa was still asleep next to me, probably dreaming about damage control for whatever fallout she was expecting from Saturday night. She had this way of compartmentalizing unpleasant situations, just pushing them into some mental box where she could deal with them later. Classic Tessa. Avoid the mess until it becomes impossible to ignore. I made my coffee, real coffee. Not that overpriced artisanal stuff her family always insisted on serving, and sat down at my computer. Time to get to work, but not the kind of work I usually did on Monday mornings. First stop, my banking app. Over the years, I'd set up automatic transfers to make everyone's life easier. $3,000 every month to cover Bree's commercial rent on that yoga studio. Over $500 for her business insurance. Another $2,000 that went into what I privately called the Family Emergency Fund, the account that somehow always got tapped whenever someone in Tessa's family had a financial crisis. Then there was the education fund I'd been contributing to for Tessa's nephew, Jackson. Kid was smart as hell, probably smarter than any of the adults in his family. And I'd been quietly setting aside money for his college expenses since he was in middle school. $500 a month, every month. Because someone needed to think about that boy's future, even if his own parents were too wrapped up in their drama to plan ahead. One by one, I canceled every single automatic transfer. Click, click, click. 8 years of financial obligation disappearing with a few mouse clicks. It was surprisingly easy, like deleting spam emails or clearing your browser history. All those monthly payments that had become as routine as brushing my teeth gone in less than 10 minutes. The immediate aftermath was silence. Beautiful, perfect silence. No phone calls, no text messages, no emergencies that required my immediate attention and financial intervention. For 3 whole days, it was like the universe had hit a pause button on the constant stream of other people's problems that somehow always became my problems. But Friday was when reality came knocking. My phone started buzzing around 10 a.m. First call was from a number I didn't recognize, probably Bree's accountant or her landlord's office. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. This one from Bree herself. Voicemail again. Then a text message that was basically a string of question marks and exclamation points, which pretty much summed up Bree's communication style in general. By noon, my phone was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Bree had apparently discovered that her rent payment had bounced, and she was working her way through every possible explanation except the obvious one. Maybe it was a banking error. Maybe there was some kind of technical glitch. Maybe the automatic transfer system had malfunctioned. The voicemail started getting progressively more frantic. Miles, honey, I think there might be a problem with the bank. Can you call me back then? Miles, this is serious. I need to talk to you right away. And finally, Miles, what the hell is going on? Call me back now. I didn't call her back. Around 2:00 p.m., Tessa called. I could hear the tension in her voice before she even said hello. Babe, what's going on? Bree's absolutely furious. She says her rent payment didn't go through, and apparently it's connected to one of our accounts somehow. I loved how she phrased that. One of our accounts, somehow, like she had no idea that I'd been covering her sister's business expenses for the better part of 4 years. Like she'd genuinely forgotten about all those conversations where she'd asked me to help out just this once, or cover things until Bree gets back on her feet. I canceled the transfers, I told her, keeping my voice as calm and matter-of-fact as if I was telling her I'd picked up dry cleaning. You what? I'm no longer subsidizing ungrateful people. Let her figure it out. There was this long pause where I could practically hear the gears grinding in Tessa's head. She was trying to process what I just said, trying to figure out if I was serious or if this was some kind of elaborate joke that she wasn't getting. Miles, you can't be serious. She's family. She's your family. I've just been your ATM. Tessa laughed. Actually laughed like I just told her the most ridiculous thing she'd ever heard. Oh my God, you're being so dramatic. Look, I get that your feelings were hurt at dinner, but this is taking it way too far. Just call the bank and fix whatever you did. Okay, that laugh was everything I needed to hear. It told me exactly how seriously she was taking this whole situation. Exactly how much she understood about what had been happening for the past 8 years. In her mind, this was just some temporary tantrum that I'd get over once I cooled down. A little blip in the normal order of things where Miles quietly takes care of everyone else's problems while they go about their lives pretending he doesn't exist. I'm not calling anyone, I said, and I'm not fixing anything. Bree wanted to know what it felt like being the most useless one at the table. Now she gets to find out what it feels like when the most useless one stops being useful. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Tessa spoke again, her voice had shifted from amused to worried. Miles, honey, I think you need to take a step back and think about this rationally. You're talking about cutting off my sister, my family. Do you understand what that means? Yeah, I said. Watching a cardinal land on the bird feeder outside my office window, it means they're about to learn the difference between being independent and being subsidized should be educational. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. Because canceling the monthly transfers was just the appetizer. The main course was going to be a real eye-opener for everyone involved, especially Bri. That evening, I was sitting in my office going through client files when I heard the front door slam hard enough to rattle the windows. Tessa's heels clicked across our hardwood floors like machine gun fire, each step getting louder and more deliberate as she made her way toward my office. I didn't need to look up to know what kind of mood she was in. The sound of her footsteps told me everything I needed to know. She appeared in my doorway like a storm cloud, still wearing the black dress she'd put on for work that morning. But now it was wrinkled, and her perfectly styled hair was coming undone. Her face was flushed red the way it got when she was trying to hold back tears and anger at the same time. "We need to talk," she said. But it came out more like a demand than a request. I saved the document I was working on, a grant proposal for a community health clinic in North Carolina, and swiveled my chair around to face her. "Okay, let's talk." She stepped into the room and crossed her arms, taking that stance she always used when she was gearing up for a fight. I just spent 2 hours on the phone with my sister trying to calm her down because she thinks her entire world is falling apart. She's crying, Miles. Actually crying. And it's all because of whatever childish tantrum you're having. Childish tantrum. I kept my voice level. Curious where she was going with this. Yes. This whole thing with cutting off her payments. I mean, come on. So she made a joke that hurt your feelings. So what? That's not a reason to destroy her business. I had to admire the way Tessa could reframe reality when it suited her purposes. A joke that hurt my feelings. Like 8 years of being treated like hired help was just about my delicate emotions. Destroy her business. I repeated by not paying for it anymore. You know what I mean? She depends on that money. Exactly. I stood up and walked over to my filing cabinet. She depends on money that comes from me while treating me like I'm some kind of parasite. Do you see the problem with that equation? Tessa followed me across the room, her voice getting higher and more strained. She's your family too, Miles. We've been married for 8 years. Her problems are our problems. That's how families work. I pulled open the bottom drawer and retrieved a thick manila folder that I've been keeping for years without really knowing why. Maybe some part of me always knew this day would come. Maybe I'm just naturally paranoid about keeping records. Either way, I was about to be very grateful for my anal retentive filing system. "No," I said, turning back to face her. "She's your family. I've just been your ATM." I set the folder down on my desk and opened it. Inside were printed bank statements, screenshots of transfers, email chains, receipts, and photocopies of checks. Every single financial interaction I'd had with her family over the years, organized chronologically and labeled with neat little tabs. Tessa's eyes went wide when she saw the contents of the folder. "What is this?" "This," I said, pulling out the first document, "is the receipt for $15,000. As I gave Bree in September 2019 to save her yoga studio from foreclosure. And this is the email where she thanked you for the help, not me. Even though the money came from my business account, I set that document aside and picked up the next one. This is the bank statement showing the $12,000 I transferred to cover Graham's DUI legal fees in 2020. And here's the text message where he thanked you for being such an amazing sister and helping him out of a tight spot." Document after document, I laid them out on the desk like I was dealing cards. Each one telling the same story, me solving problems, them thanking Tessa, everyone pretending the money just magically appeared whenever they needed it. "And these," I said, pulling out a stack of papers that was significantly thicker than the others, "are the records of every time I've bailed out your parents when their property taxes came due. 3 separate occasions totaling $35,000. Your dad's exact words the last time were, 'Thank God Tessa married into money.' Into money, Tessa. Like you had some secret trust fund I didn't know about." Her mouth was opening and closing like she was trying to speak, but couldn't figure out what words to use. She picked up one of the bank statements, staring at it like it was written in a foreign language. I didn't realize. She started, then stopped. "You didn't realize what?" "That money doesn't just appear out of thin air. That every time your family had a crisis and you came to me asking for help just this once, it was actually my money solving their problems. I thought, we're married. Our money is our money, right? Our money. I laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. Tessa, you make $42,000 a year at the gallery. I made 6 figures last year alone. When exactly did your money become part of the equation? She set the bank statement down with shaking hands. You've been keeping track of all this. I keep track of everything. It's called being responsible with money. It's called knowing where every dollar goes and why. Your family might run on magical thinking and good vibes, but I live in the real world where bills actually have to be paid by real people with real money. Tessa was looking at the spread of documents like they were evidence of some crime she didn't know she'd committed. In a way, I guess they were. Miles, I had no idea you felt like this. If you just talk to me, talk to you. I interrupted Tessa. Every single one of these situations started with you coming to me and asking for help. Every single time you knew exactly where the money was coming from. You just never bothered to make sure anyone else knew. She was crying now, which should have made me feel guilty. A few weeks ago, it would have made me feel guilty. But right now, looking at 8 years of documented evidence that my own wife had been treating me like a silent partner in my own marriage, I just felt tired. I never meant for it to be like this, she whispered. But it was like this. For 8 years, it was exactly like this. And the worst part, you were okay with it. You were okay with letting your family think I was useless as long as I kept being useful to them. I started gathering up the documents, putting them back in the folder in the same careful order I'd kept them in. What happens now? Tessa asked. I looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. She was still beautiful, still the woman I'd fallen in love with in college. But she was also someone who'd spent 8 years allowing her family to treat me like garbage while benefiting from my generosity. Now, I said, closing the folder, they get to find out what independence actually costs. But I wasn't done revealing the depth of this situation. Not even close. The silence in my office stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Tessa was still staring at the folder of documents, probably trying to process the fact that her husband had been keeping meticulous records of every financial favor he'd done for her family. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the monthly transfers were just the tip of the iceberg. I walked over to my safe, the small fireproof one I kept behind my desk for important documents. Tessa watched me dial in the combination, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. She probably figured I was getting out more bank statements, maybe some additional receipts that would make her feel even worse about the situation. She had no idea what was coming. You remember 2018, right? I said, pulling out a legal-sized envelope that had been sitting in my safe for 6 years when Bree's yoga studio was about to go under. Of course I remember. That's when you helped her out with the rent money. Not just rent money, Tessa. She was 2 weeks away from total foreclosure. The landlord had already started eviction proceedings. Her equipment suppliers were threatening to repossess everything. She owed money to everyone. The electric company, the water company, her insurance provider. We're not talking about a little cash flow problem. We're talking about complete business failure. I sat back down and set the envelope on the desk between us. It was thick, official-looking with the letterhead of Morrison & Associates, the law firm I'd used to handle the paperwork. She came to our house on a Tuesday night, I continued. Do you remember that? Crying so hard she could barely speak, begging for help. Said she'd do anything, sign anything, agree to anything if I could just save her business. Tessa nodded slowly. I remember she was a mess. She was desperate, and desperate people make desperate decisions. I opened the envelope and pulled out a document that had been notarized, witnessed, and filed with the state of South Carolina. So, when I agreed to bail her out, I made sure there were some conditions. I handed her the contract. Tessa took it with shaking hands and started reading. I watched her eyes move across the page, saw the exact moment when she reached the crucial paragraph because her face went completely white. "Miles," she whispered, "it says that in exchange for the $25,000 I provided to save her business, plus an additional $15,000 for operating capital, Bree signed over 51% equity in Sacred Space Yoga Studio to me." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm not just her benefactor, Tessa. I'm the majority shareholder." The document slipped from her fingers and fluttered to the floor. "You own her business." "Majority shareholder," I corrected, "which means I have controlling interest in all major business decisions. Hiring, firing, lease agreements, expansion plans, profit distribution, all of it goes through me." Tessa was shaking her head like she could make this information disappear through sheer force of will. But she's been running it like it's hers. She makes all the decisions. She makes day-to-day operational decisions because I've allowed her to. But legally, contractually, I own 51% of everything. The equipment, the client list, the lease agreement, the business name, all of it. I picked up the contract from where it had fallen and flipped to the signature page. There was in black and white Bree's flowing signature right next to mine, with a notary seal and 2 witnesses. Completely legal, completely binding, completely forgotten by everyone except me. "How could you not tell me about this?" Tessa's voice was barely above a whisper. "How could you not know about this? You were there when she signed it. You were sitting right there at our kitchen table when I explained the terms to her. I thought it was just paperwork, like a loan agreement or something. It was paperwork, very specific paperwork that transferred ownership of her business to me in exchange for the money I was providing. She read it, Tessa. Her lawyer reviewed it. She understood exactly what she was signing. Her lawyer, the one I paid for because she couldn't afford legal representation, remember? So I hired Morrison and Associates to represent her interests, make sure she understood the contract completely. Cost me another $3,000. But I wanted everything to be completely above board. Tessa was looking at me like I was a stranger. "You've been keeping this secret for 6 years. I haven't been keeping it secret. I just haven't been broadcasting it. There's a difference. The paperwork is filed with the state. It's a matter of public record. Anyone who bothered to look could have found it. But Bree doesn't know. Bree knows. She just chooses not to think about it. It's easier for her to pretend she's an independent business owner than to acknowledge that she's essentially been working as my employee for the past 6 years. I pulled out another document from the envelope, the operating agreement we'd signed along with the equity transfer. According to this, as majority shareholder, I'm entitled to 51% of all profits generated by the business. I've never claimed that money, never asked for it, never even mentioned it. I've been letting her keep 100% of the profits from a business I majority own. Why would you do that? Because family comes first, right? Because we help each other out. Because that's what good people do. I met her eyes, but apparently being good people only applies to me. Everyone else gets to be selfish. Tessa was crying again, but this time it wasn't just sadness. It was the kind of crying that happens when you realize the world isn't what you thought it was. When the foundations of everything you believe turn out to be built on quicksand. "Miles, I swear I didn't know. I knew you'd helped her, but I had no idea it was like this." No, I said you didn't want to know. None of you did. It was easier to just assume the money fairy was taking care of everything. I put the contract back in the envelope and returned it to my safe. So, when Bree made her little joke about me being the most useless person at the table, she was essentially insulting her own business partner, the person who owns the majority stake in everything she thinks she's built. What are you going to do? That was the million-dollar question, wasn't it? What exactly was I going to do with this information? For 6 years, I'd been content to let Bree run her business and pretend it was entirely hers. I'd been the silent partner, the invisible investor, the guy who owned everything but claimed nothing. But things were different now. Now I had been publicly humiliated by someone who owed her entire livelihood to my generosity. Now I was done being invisible. Well, I said, I think it's time I started acting like a majority shareholder. Sunday afternoon rolled around like clockwork, and for the first time in 8 years, I was actually looking forward to. Not because I expected anything pleasant, hell no, but because I knew this was going to be the last time I'd ever sit at that table as the family punching bag. Today, I was walking in with a purpose that had nothing to do with keeping the peace. I dressed carefully for the occasion. Nothing fancy, just clean jeans and a button-down shirt. The same kind of outfit that had been earning me condescending looks for years. But this time, I made sure to bring something extra. My leather messenger bag, the one I used for business meetings. Inside was a single manila folder containing documents that were about to change everything. Tessa had been walking around our house like a ghost all weekend, barely speaking to me except to ask if I was really going through with this whole thing. She still didn't seem to understand that there was no going back from here. No magical reset button that would put us back to the way things were before her sister decided to publicly humiliate me. The drive to her parents' house was dead silent. Tessa stared out the passenger window while I focused on the road. Both of us probably thinking about how this afternoon was going to play out. I had a pretty good idea what to expect. Bree would be furious about the missed rent payment, probably ready to tear into me the moment I walked through the door. Her parents would be confused and defensive. Graham would try to stay out of it entirely. What they weren't expecting was for me to come in swinging. We pulled into the circular driveway of that big house on Trad Street, the one with the historic marker out front and the perfectly manicured garden that required a full-time groundskeeper to maintain. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and followed Tessa up the front steps, past the columns that were probably older than my entire hometown back in Georgia. Patricia answered the door with her usual air of gracious hostility. The kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. Miles, dear, how wonderful to see you. I trust you're feeling better after. Well, after last weekend's little misunderstanding. Little misunderstanding, right? Like her daughter hadn't just spent 8 years treating me like hired help before finally saying the quiet part out loud. I'm feeling great, Patricia. Thanks for asking. The living room was set up exactly like always. Everett in his leather chair with a bourbon. Patricia perched on the sofa like she was posing for a magazine photo. Graham sprawled in the corner chair trying to look invisible. And Bree sitting ramrod straight with her arms crossed, radiating anger like heat from a furnace. She didn't waste any time getting started. Okay, Miles, what the hell is your problem? She said before I'd even sat down. Do you have any idea what you've put me through this week? My rent bounced. My insurance payment failed. And now my landlord is threatening to review my lease terms. All because you decided to throw some kind of tantrum. I set my bag down next to my chair and looked around the room at all these people who'd been benefiting from my generosity for years while treating me like garbage. My problem, Bree, is that I'm tired of being disrespected by people I've been supporting. supporting. She let out this bitter laugh that sounded exactly like her sister. Miles, honey, you help out sometimes. But let's not pretend you're supporting anyone. I built my business from the ground up. Did you now? I opened my bag and pulled out the folder. That's interesting because I have some paperwork here that tells a very different story. Everett set down his bourbon glass with a sharp clink. Now hold on, son. I don't know what kind of documents you think you have. But I want my company back, Bree interrupted, her voice getting shrill. Whatever weird financial arrangement you think you have with my business, I want it stopped today. The room went quiet. Even Graham looked up from his phone. Your company, I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm. Bree, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. I opened the folder and pulled out the equity transfer agreement, the same one I'd shown Tessa a few days earlier. What you built from the ground up was actually built with $40,000 of my money, in exchange for which you signed over 51% ownership of Sacred Space Yoga Studio to me. I handed the document to Everett, who put on his reading glasses and started scanning the pages. I watched his face change as he read, saw the exact moment when the reality of the situation hit him. This can't be right, he said. But his voice had lost all its authority. It's completely right. Notarized, witnessed, filed with the state. Your daughter has been operating my business for the past 6 years. Bree lunged forward and snatched the papers from her father's hands. This is you tricked me into signing this. I was desperate. I wasn't thinking clearly. You had a lawyer, I said. I paid for your lawyer. Morrison and Associates reviewed every line of that contract to make sure you understood exactly what you were agreeing to. Patricia was looking back and forth between the document and my face like she was trying to solve a puzzle. But Miles, dear, why didn't you ever mention this before? Because I was trying to be a good family member. I was trying to let Bree run her business and maintain her dignity while I stayed in the background. But apparently staying in the background just made it easier for everyone to forget that I exist. Everett stood up, trying to reclaim some kind of control over the situation. Now see here, boy. I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but you're tearing this family apart. No, Everett. I'm not tearing anything apart. I stood up too, meeting his glare with steady eye contact. I'm the one who's been holding it together. I reached into my bag and pulled out another stack of papers. Bank statements, canceled checks, transfer confirmations, everything I'd shown Tessa. Plus a few additional documents I'd printed out for this specific occasion. Graham's DUI legal fees, your property tax bailouts, Bree's business loans, Tessa's nephew's education fund, 8 years of financial records showing exactly who's been keeping this family afloat while you all pretended I was dead weight. I spread the documents across Patricia's antique coffee table like I was laying out a poker hand. $47,000 to Bry, $12,000 to Graham, $35,000 to you and Patricia. That's almost $100,000 of my money that went to solving your family's problems. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. I want an apology, I said, and I want acknowledgement of what I've done for this family. Bree was staring at the contract like it was a snake that might bite her. I want my business back. Then buy me out, I said. 51% of current market value plus the $40,000 in principal I originally invested plus 6 years of accumulated interest should come to about $120,000. Her face went white. I don't have that kind of money. Then I guess you're working for me now. The room exploded into chaos. Everyone talking at once, voices raised, accusations flying. but I just sat there in the middle of it all, completely calm, watching 8 years of resentment finally come to the surface. The truth, as it turned out, was a hell of a lot louder than their lies had ever been. 1 week later, I was sitting in my office reviewing a grant proposal for a community college in Tennessee when the doorbell rang. Through my window, I could see a guy in a cheap suit standing on my front porch holding an official-looking envelope. Process server. I'd been expecting this ever since the family dinner from hell. So I wasn't surprised when he handed me legal documents with my name on them. What did surprise me was how fast Bree had managed to pull it together. The woman who couldn't balance her own checkbook had somehow found herself a lawyer and filed a lawsuit in less than a week. I had to give her credit for efficiency, even if everything else about this situation was completely insane. The complaint was exactly what I'd expected. Plaintiff seeks damages for defendant's unconscionable exploitation of plaintiff's emotional distress and financial desperation. In plain English, she was claiming I'd taken advantage of her when she was desperate and tricked her into signing over her business. It was creative. I'll give her that. Complete, but creative. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same woman who'd spent 6 years treating me like I was invisible was now accusing me of being some kind of manipulative mastermind who'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to steal her yoga studio. According to her version of events, I was apparently both completely useless and diabolically clever. I called Sandra Wu's office that afternoon. I'd worked with Sandra before on some contract disputes related to my consulting business, and she had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when clients tried to pull fast ones on her. She was exactly what I needed for this situation. Her office was in one of those converted historic buildings downtown, all exposed brick and modern furniture that cost more than most people's cars. Sandra was waiting for me in her conference room when I arrived, already reviewing copies of the documents I'd faxed over. "So," she said without looking up from the paperwork, "your sister-in-law is suing you for being too generous. That's a new one. Apparently, generosity is a crime now if you document it properly." Sandra finally looked up at me, and I could see that predatory gleam in her eyes that probably terrified opposing counsel. "Miles, I've been practicing law for 15 years, and I've seen every kind of frivolous lawsuit you can imagine. This one doesn't even make the top 50. She spread out the equity transfer agreement on the conference table, pointing to specific paragraphs with her pen. "Look at this language. In exchange for the sum of $40,000 provided by Miles Granger, Sacred Space Yoga LLC, hereby transfers 51% equity ownership to Miles Granger." It's crystal clear. No ambiguity, no complex legal jargon, no fine print. Her lawyer thinks he can argue emotional distress. Her lawyer can argue whatever he wants. But emotional distress doesn't void a legitimate business contract, especially when she had independent legal representation during the signing. Sandra flipped to another page. "Which reminds me, you said you paid for her attorney, Morrison and Associates, $3,000 for them to review the contract and explain her obligations. Perfect. So she can't claim she didn't understand what she was signing because she had a lawyer specifically hired to make sure she understood. And she can't claim coercion because you provided her with independent counsel." Sandra was practically grinning. "Now, Miles, this is what we call a slam dunk." Over the next hour, Sandra walked me through her strategy. We'd file a counter motion for summary judgment, basically asking the court to throw out Bree's case without even going to trial. We'd present the contract, the legal representation records, the email chains showing Bree's grateful acceptance of my help, and the 6 years of business records showing she'd operated under the agreement without complaint. The beauty of this case, Sandra explained, is that your sister-in-law is essentially arguing that contracts don't matter if you regret signing them later. If that were true, every business deal in America would be subject to buyer's remorse lawsuits. We also discussed Bree's chances of success, which Sandra put at approximately 0. She's claiming you exploited her emotional state. But the timeline doesn't support that. You gave her independent legal counsel, you documented everything properly, and you never tried to exercise your ownership rights until she publicly humiliated you. No reasonable judge is going to see exploitation in that pattern. The discovery phase was going to be particularly brutal for Bry. Sandra had already requested all of her business records, communications, and financial statements for the past 6 years. We were also demanding depositions from everyone who'd witnessed the original signing, including her parents and the lawyers at Morrison and Associates. "Here's what's going to happen," Sandra said as we wrapped up the meeting. Her lawyer is going to spend about 3 weeks reviewing the evidence, realize his client lied to him about the circumstances, and then quietly suggest she drop the lawsuit before it gets to court. And if she doesn't, then we bury her in facts. We show the court exactly what kind of person files a lawsuit against someone who saved her business, and we make sure she pays our legal fees when this is over. Sandra was right, of course. 3 weeks later, Bree's lawyer called Sandra's office requesting a settlement conference. Apparently, once he'd reviewed all the documentation and taken depositions from the witnesses, he discovered that his client's version of events bore no resemblance to reality, but I wasn't interested in settling. I'd been quiet and accommodating for 8 years, and where had it gotten me? It was time for some public accountability. The Charleston County Courthouse felt like stepping into a movie set, all marble columns and polished wood, the kind of place where justice was supposed to happen whether you had money or not. I sat next to Sandra at the plaintiff's table, watching Bree and her lawyer huddled together across the aisle, probably going over their story one last time. Bree's attorney was younger than I'd expected, probably fresh out of law school and desperate enough to take a case that any experienced lawyer would have laughed out of his office. He spent the first 20 minutes painting Bree as this helpless victim who'd been manipulated by her cunning brother-in-law during her darkest hour. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing dramatically toward Bree. "My client was facing financial ruin when the defendant swooped in with what appeared to be a generous offer of help. But hidden in that help was a trap, a contract designed to steal everything she'd worked for. It was a good performance. I'll give him that. If I didn't know the actual facts, I might have felt sorry for her myself." Then Sandra stood up. She didn't waste time with emotional appeals or dramatic gestures. Instead, she walked over to the evidence table and picked up the equity transfer agreement. "Your Honor, this case can be resolved very simply. Did the plaintiff sign this contract?" "Yes." "Did she have legal representation when she signed it?" "Yes." "Did she operate under this contract for 6 years without complaint?" "Yes." Sandra presented our timeline like she was teaching a history lesson. The recorded phone calls where Bree begged for help. The emails showing her gratitude after I saved her business. The bank records proving I'd never taken a dime of the profits I was legally entitled to. 6 years of evidence that I'd been the most hands-off business partner in history. "The plaintiff claims she was tricked," Sandra continued. "But the evidence shows she was helped. She claims she was exploited, but the record shows she was rescued. And now, when her benefactor has finally asked for basic respect, she responds with a frivolous lawsuit." The judge, an older black woman with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense, cut through everything with surgical precision. She reviewed the contract, the legal representation records, and the pattern of behavior over 6 years. "Ms. Reed," she said, looking directly at Bry, You accepted these funds, knowing full well what the terms were. You had independent counsel explain those terms to you. You operated your business under this agreement for 6 years. This court finds no evidence of fraud, coercion, or unconscionable conduct on the part of Mr. Granger. Bree broke down crying when the judge ruled in my favor. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure rage. The fury of someone who just discovered that consequences actually exist. Tessa had been sitting in the gallery during the whole proceeding. When I looked back at her after the verdict, she was already gone. No congratulations, no acknowledgement that justice had been served. Just empty space where my wife should have been. I walked out of that courthouse with my vindication and my legal victory. But somehow it felt less like winning and more like finally waking up. 4 months later, I'm sitting on my back porch with a cup of coffee and a watercolor palette, watching the morning light filter through the live oak trees in my yard. It's Thursday, which means absolutely nothing to me anymore, except that it's another day I get to live exactly how I want to live. Tessa moved out 3 weeks after the court ruling. She packed her things while I was at a client meeting, left her keys on the kitchen counter, and disappeared into whatever life she thought she deserved. No dramatic confrontation, no tearful goodbye, no acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, she owed me an apology for 8 years of letting her family treat me like garbage. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in years. I paint now, not because I have to impress anyone or because it serves some greater purpose, but because I want to. Watercolors mostly, sometimes acrylics when I'm feeling ambitious. Last week, I finished a series of Charleston Street scenes that actually captured something real about this city. The way the light hits the old buildings just right. How the shadows fall across cobblestone streets that have seen more history than most people can imagine. Bree's yoga studio is still standing barely. Turns out when you have to actually pay your own bills instead of relying on your invisible benefactor, running a business gets a lot more complicated. I haven't exercised my ownership rights, haven't demanded my share of the profits, haven't interfered with her operations at all. I'm just letting her figure out what independence actually costs. She'll probably make it. Bree's a lot of things. Ungrateful, entitled, cruel when she thinks she can get away with it. But she's not stupid. The question is whether she'll learn anything from this experience or just find someone else to subsidize her dreams. I cook dinner for myself every night now. Real meals, not just whatever was easiest after a long day of taking care of everyone else's problems. Tonight, I'm making shrimp and grits, the way my grandmother taught me when I was 12 years old. Simple food, honest ingredients, no pretense required. Sometimes I think about dating again. There's this woman who works at the coffee shop downtown, always has pain under her fingernails, and reads actual books instead of scrolling through her phone. We've talked a few times about art, about Charleston, about how sometimes the best conversations happen with strangers. Maybe something will come of that. Maybe it won't. For the first time in 8 years, I'm okay with not knowing. Because here's what I learned. When someone calls you useless, they're really telling you how useful you've been to them. And that's your cue to walk away and discover who you are when you're not carrying everyone else's weight. I'm lighter now. Free. And I wouldn't trade this.